In 1935, a Norwegian immigrant named Abraham Vereide stood in a Seattle hotel room and claimed God spoke to him, not through thunder or burning bushes, but through a simple thought that would reshape American power for the next 90 years. The message was straightforward. Stop trying to help the poor. Start recruiting the powerful instead. This wasn't a fringe cult meeting in basements. This was a network that would eventually count presidents, senators, dictators, and corporate leaders among its members. They called themselves the Family. Others knew them as the Fellowship. Most Americans had never heard of them at all. For decades, they operated in plain sight, hosting the National Prayer Breakfast, maintaining a mansion on Capitol Hill, facilitating relationships between American politicians and foreign leaders. But they left almost no paper trail, no membership lists, no public statements of belief, just relationships built quietly over breakfast meetings and private retreats. Their core idea was dangerously simple. Jesus didn't come for the weak. He came to teach leadership. And if you could get the right leaders to follow the right version of Christ, you could change entire nations without anyone noticing. This is the story of how a quiet prayer group became one of the most influential and least understood organizations in modern American politics. It's a story about power and faith, about secrecy and influence, about how good intentions can produce catastrophic results when combined with theological certainty and political ambition. It's about men who believed they were chosen by God to rule, and the network that told them they were right. Abraham Vereide arrived in America in 1905 AD with $30 in his pocket and a theology degree from a Norwegian seminary. He was 19 years old. Like many immigrants, he believed America was where God's work happened, where the future was built, where destiny unfolded in ways the old world couldn't contain. The journey from Norway had taken weeks by steamship. Vereide traveled in steerage, sharing cramped quarters with other immigrants fleeing poverty or seeking opportunity. He arrived in New York Harbor and saw the Statue of Liberty like millions before him, a symbol of promise, of possibility, of a nation where anything could happen if you worked hard enough and believed deeply enough. He made his way west to the Pacific Northwest. Seattle was booming. The gold rush had brought waves of fortune seekers through the city. Timber money was building mansions on the hills. The port connected America to Asia, and money flowed through the docks like seawater. But there was another Seattle too. The city of workers crammed into boarding houses, of men who lost fingers in sawmills and died in logging accidents, of families living in tar paper shacks while robber barons built palaces. This was the Seattle where Vereide started his ministry. He spent his first 3 decades doing exactly what you'd expect from a young minister with a heart for social justice. He ran missions in poor neighborhoods, preaching to men who smelled of fish and sawdust. He organized food drives and clothing collections. He set up shelters where homeless men could sleep without fear of being arrested for vagrancy. This was the social gospel tradition, Christianity as practical aid to the suffering. It was popular in the early 20th century among Protestant ministers who saw industrial capitalism creating massive inequality. They believed the church should do more than save souls for the afterlife. It should work to create heaven on earth, or at least to ease hell for those trapped at the bottom. Vereide threw himself into this work. He was earnest, hard-working, genuinely compassionate. The men he served trusted him. They'd line up for the soup he served, listen to his sermons, sometimes cry when he prayed with them about their broken lives. But by the mid-1930s, Vereide had become deeply frustrated. The Great Depression had hit Seattle hard. Unemployment reached 30%. Banks failed, businesses closed, families lost their homes, soup lines stretched for blocks. Men who'd worked their entire lives suddenly found themselves begging for bread. And Vereide watched his ministry's impact evaporate like morning mist. He could feed 100 men today. There'd be 200 hungry tomorrow. He could shelter families through winter. Spring would bring new evictions. He could preach hope and faith, but empty stomachs and empty pockets made hope feel like mockery. The labor movement was growing more radical. Seattle had a history of labor organizing going back to the 1919 AD general strike. when 65,000 workers shut down the city for 5 days. Now, with unemployment devastating working families, unions were organizing again, and some were embracing communist ideology. They argued that capitalism itself was the problem, that private ownership of industry inevitably created exploitation, that only revolution could bring justice. Verrider found this deeply troubling. He believed in private property and free enterprise, but more than that, he believed communism was atheistic at its core, a system that denied God and tried to build paradise through human will alone. He saw it as a spiritual threat, not just a political one. At the same time, he was becoming disillusioned with his own approach. 30 years of ministry to the poor had produced what, exactly? Some men fed, some families housed. But the broader structures that created poverty remained unchanged. The same businessmen who sat on church boards and donated to missions paid starvation wages at their factories. The same politicians who praised Christian charity voted against labor protections and social welfare programs. Verrider began to see poverty work as treating symptoms instead of causes. You could bandage the wounded all day long, but if you never addressed what was wounding them, the carnage would continue. And the people doing the wounding, the factory owners, the politicians, the financiers, were untouched by Christian ministry. They attended nice churches, sang hymns on Sunday, and went back to business as usual on Monday. This is where the hotel room vision enters the story. According to Verrider's own writings, and he was meticulous about documenting his spiritual experiences, he was praying alone one evening in 1935 AD when God spoke to him, not audibly, but unmistakably. A thought entered his mind with such clarity and force that he knew it came from outside himself. The message was simple. Stop wasting time with the down and out. Start focusing on the up and out instead. Verrider understood immediately what this meant. God was redirecting his ministry from the poor to the powerful, from those at the bottom of society to those at the top, from the people shaped by decisions to the people making those decisions. If you could reach them, if you could change their hearts and minds, you could change everything downstream. It was a complete inversion of Jesus' teachings as most Christians understood them. The Gospels are filled with stories about shepherds and lepers, prostitutes and tax collectors. Jesus' first sermon announced good news to the poor and freedom for prisoners. He told his followers that whatever they did for the least of these, they did for him. He explicitly said it's harder for a rich man to enter heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. But Verrider saw something different in the text. He went back through scripture looking for evidence that God worked through leaders, not masses. And once you start looking for that pattern, you find it everywhere. God chose Abraham to found a nation. He chose Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. He chose kings, Saul, David, Solomon, to rule his people. Even when those kings failed catastrophically, God didn't replace the system with democracy. He chose new leaders. In the New Testament, Verrider focused on Jesus' relationship with his disciples. Yes, Jesus preached to crowds of thousands, but he didn't build an organization from those crowds. Instead, he selected 12 men and invested deeply in them. He trained them, mentored them, taught them privately what he didn't teach publicly. And Verrider noticed something else about those 12 men. They weren't the bottom of society. Peter wasn't just a fisherman. He was a boat owner, someone with capital and employees. Matthew was a tax collector, which meant he was literate, numerate, and connected to Roman power structures. Simon the Zealot may have been part of a revolutionary movement. These were men with agency, with resources, with the capacity to make things happen. Jesus chose leaders among working people, Verrider reasoned. Men who had influence in their communities, who others looked to for guidance. He built his movement by identifying and developing leadership. Verrider also reread the crucifixion story with new eyes. Jesus died between two thieves, nobodies, criminals, people without power or status. They died unnoticed by history. But who declared Jesus the Son of God at the moment of death? A Roman centurion, a military officer, a man of authority. Power recognized power. This interpretation required ignoring vast amounts of contrary evidence in Scripture. It required reading selectively, emphasizing certain passages while downplaying others. But Variety was convinced he'd discovered something other Christians had missed, a hidden pattern of how God actually worked in the world. He decided to test his theory. In 1935 AD, Variety began organizing breakfast meetings for Seattle businessmen, not churches or public events, but private gatherings of factory owners, shipping magnates, bankers, and politicians. He called them prayer breakfasts, but they were really something else, networking sessions wrapped in spiritual language. The format was deliberately simple: meet early, before the workday begins, share a meal, bacon, eggs, coffee, nothing fancy, pray together, but keep the prayers generic enough that Catholics, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists could all participate without theological friction. Then talk about leadership, about responsibility, about how Christian values should guide business and government. No sermons from Variety, no theological lectures, no demands that attendees change their lives or give away their wealth. Instead, affirmation. Variety told these men that their success wasn't something to feel guilty about. It was evidence of God's blessing. Their wealth wasn't greed. It was stewardship of resources God had entrusted to them. Their power wasn't something to apologize for. It was a calling to lead, to shape society according to divine principles. This message was intoxicating to men who'd spent their lives accumulating power while being told by churches that the rich couldn't enter heaven. Variety was offering them something different, not condemnation, but validation, not demands for charity, but recognition of their importance, not calls to serve the poor, but invitations to join an elite fellowship of Christian leaders. And it worked brilliantly. What Variety understood, and what made his approach so effective, was that powerful people face a particular kind of isolation. They make decisions that affect thousands of lives. They face constant criticism from workers, journalists, reformers. They compete ruthlessly with peers, never knowing who to trust. They can't show weakness or uncertainty without inviting attack. Where could such men be vulnerable? Not at work, where every conversation was strategic. Not at home, where their families depended on their strength. Not at their country clubs, where status competition never stopped. Variety created a space where these men could lower their guards. The prayer breakfasts happened before business hours, before the day's battles began. The atmosphere was deliberately non-threatening, just breakfast among friends. But the friendship came with permission to be honest about doubts, fears, and moral struggles. A factory owner could admit he didn't know how to respond to union organizing. A politician could confess uncertainty about a difficult vote. A banker could express fear that his business decisions might be destroying lives. And instead of judgment, they received support. Instead of demands to change their behavior, they received affirmation that they were chosen for difficult times. Instead of calls to redistribute wealth or empower workers, they received encouragement to lead firmly, to trust their instincts, to see opposition as spiritual warfare rather than legitimate criticism. This is where Variety's theology became more than just creative Bible interpretation. It became a psychological tool for maintaining power. He told business leaders they weren't greedy, they were stewards of God's resources. This reframing removed guilt about inequality. If God had given you wealth, then keeping it wasn't selfishness, it was faithfulness. He told politicians they weren't power-hungry, they were chosen to lead. This reframing transformed ambition into calling. If God wanted you in office, then pursuing power was obedience, not ego. He told all of them that their critics were wrong, not just mistaken, but spiritually deceived. Labor organizers demanding better wages, they didn't understand that God ordained social hierarchies. Reformers calling for regulation, they lacked faith that God would guide leaders to do right. Socialists advocating redistribution, they were rebelling against divine order itself. This worldview was profoundly comforting to people whose decisions created suffering. It allowed them to sleep at night, to see themselves as good Christians even while fighting against workers' rights, opposing social welfare, and concentrating wealth. Because in Variety's framework, they weren't hurting people, they were fulfilling God's plan. By 1940 AD, Varidi had organized breakfast groups in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Each group operated independently, with no formal structure connecting them. This was intentional and crucial. Varidi didn't want an organization that could be infiltrated, regulated, or exposed. He wanted a movement, invisible, organic, impossible to pin down or control. Members didn't even call themselves members. They were friends, connected through personal relationships rather than institutional loyalty. There were no membership cards, no dues, no official roster, just men who met for breakfast and understood themselves to be part of something bigger. This structure made the family almost impossible to track or combat. How do you regulate an organization that doesn't officially exist? How do you criticize a group that has no public face? How do you organize opposition to a network that operates entirely through private relationships? You can't, which was exactly the point. The breakthrough came in 1942 AD. America had entered World War II, and Washington, D.C. suddenly became the center of global power. Every major decision about the war effort flowed through the capital. Generals, admirals, cabinet secretaries, congressmen, all gathered in Washington to coordinate the largest military mobilization in history. Varidi recognized the opportunity and moved to Washington permanently. He began organizing prayer breakfasts for congressmen and senators, approaching them through personal introductions. He never presented it as lobbying or political organizing, just an opportunity for Christian leaders to support each other through prayer and fellowship. Politicians found it surprisingly appealing. Congress is intensely competitive. Members guard their positions jealously, attack opponents ruthlessly, and trust almost no one. But Varidi's breakfasts offered something different, a space outside partisan warfare where relationships could form. A Democratic senator could pray with a Republican congressman and find common ground. A liberal could sit next to a conservative and discover they shared values beyond politics. And all of them could feel they were part of something transcendent, not just politicians, but Christian leaders with a higher calling. During this period, Varidi met a man who would significantly influence his thinking, Frank Buchman. Buchman was a charismatic American evangelist who ran a movement called Moral Rearmament, previously known as the Oxford Group. His approach to Christianity was radically different from traditional churches and would profoundly shape the family's future direction. Buchman believed in what he called God control. The idea was that Christians should surrender completely to divine guidance in every decision, not just spiritual matters, but business deals, political choices, personal relationships, everything. You achieved this through practices he called the four absolutes: absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. In practice, this meant spending time in quiet meditation, listening for God's voice, and following whatever guidance came, even if it contradicted reason, advice from others, or conventional wisdom. Buchman had organized house parties for wealthy and powerful people throughout the 1920s and 1930s. These gatherings brought together businessmen, politicians, and even royalty for weekends of spiritual sharing and prayer. The emphasis was on personal transformation rather than social reform. Change individuals, and society would follow. But Buchman had a controversial history that complicated his movement. In 1936 AD, he gave an interview to the New York World Telegram where he made a shocking statement. "I thank heaven for a man like Adolf Hitler," Buchman said, "who built a front line of defense against the Antichrist of communism." The quote created a scandal that haunted Buchman for years. He later claimed his words were taken out of context, that he'd been trying to say something about opposing communism rather than endorsing Hitler specifically, but the damage was done and the sentiment was revealing. Buchman saw strong authoritarian leaders as potentially useful, provided they served the right spiritual purpose. He believed that democracy could be weak, that it allowed moral decay and communist infiltration. What the world needed was leaders who submitted completely to God's will, and such leaders might need to exercise firm, even authoritarian control to implement divine guidance. This idea that strong leaders chosen by God could reshape nations if they had absolute commitment would become absolutely central to the family's worldview. Variety absorbed Buchmann's thinking, but refined it. He dropped the public pronouncements and controversial political statements that had gotten Buchmann in trouble. He kept the focus on personal relationships and private influence, and he developed what he called the biblical leadership model, a framework for understanding how God worked through powerful individuals to shape history. The model was elegant in its simplicity. Jesus, according to Varidy's reading, was history's greatest leader, but he didn't organize mass movements or give fiery speeches to crowds. That was what the disciples did after he left. During his ministry, Jesus focused on building a small group of intensely loyal followers, 12 men who would carry his message after his death. This small group strategy was the key to changing the world. Varidy called these small groups cells. A cell was never more than 12 people, ideally fewer. They met regularly to pray, to support each other, and crucially, to discuss how they could influence their spheres of power for Christ. These weren't Bible study groups where people discussed theology. They were strategic alliances where powerful people coordinated action. Each cell operated independently. There was no central authority dictating what cells should do or believe, no board of directors, no financial oversight, no public accountability. This made the network incredibly resilient. If one cell was exposed or disbanded, the others continued functioning. If a member faced scandal, other members might distance themselves publicly while maintaining private support, and the cell structure meant no formal organization could be implicated. Variety recruited very carefully. He looked for men who were already influential, not people who might become powerful someday, but people who held power now. Congressmen, military officers, business executives, judges. He approached them privately, usually through personal introductions from existing members. He never presented the group as an organization you joined. Instead, he invited people into a fellowship, a community of like-minded leaders seeking God's guidance together. The invitation came with no formal commitment, no membership card, no dues, just an offer to meet for breakfast and prayer with other Christian leaders. Once someone joined a cell, the real work began. Members were encouraged to see their positions of power as divinely ordained. A senator wasn't elected by voters. He was chosen by God to shape legislation. A CEO didn't rise through corporate competition. He was appointed to steward resources. A general didn't earn his rank through military service. He was selected to wield force on God's behalf. This reframing had profound psychological effects. It removed guilt about wealth and power. If God placed you in a position of authority, then using that authority aggressively wasn't arrogance. It was faithfulness. If you enriched yourself through business, that wasn't greed. It was accepting God's blessing. If you made decisions that hurt some people, that wasn't cruelty. It was the difficult responsibility of leadership. It also created a sense of special obligation. Members were told they weren't just politicians or businessmen. They were key men in God's plan for history. The decisions they made mattered not just politically or economically, but spiritually. They weren't accountable primarily to voters or shareholders. They were accountable to God, who had chosen them for this moment. Members also learned a specific way of operating in the world. Variety taught them to work invisibly. Don't announce your faith publicly in ways that invite scrutiny. Don't attach your name to religious causes that might become controversial. Instead, build relationships quietly. Have breakfast with the right people. Make a phone call when it matters. Influence outcomes without ever appearing to push. This approach was brilliant for several interconnected reasons. First, it avoided the backlash that more visible Christian political movements faced. There were no protests outside the family's offices because nobody knew where those offices were, or if they even existed. There were no media exposés because journalists couldn't report on meetings that left no records. There was no organized opposition because most people didn't know the family existed. Second, it was incredibly effective. Personal relationships often matter more than public campaigns. A private conversation over breakfast could change a senator's vote more effectively than thousands of constituent phone calls. An introduction at a prayer meeting could open diplomatic channels that years of formal negotiation couldn't establish. A quiet word of support during a scandal could keep a politician in office when public pressure demanded resignation. Third, it created perfect plausible deniability. If a family member did something controversial, there was no paper trail linking them to the organization. They were acting as individuals, following their own conscience, which happened to align with what other family members believed. But that was just Christian fellowship, not coordination. By 1944 AD, Varidi had established cells in most major American cities. Businessmen met for prayer in Seattle, Chicago, and New York. Politicians gathered in Washington. Military officers connected through cells at various bases. Each group operated independently, but they shared the same basic theology and approach. But Varidi's real ambition was bigger than individual cells. He wanted to create an event that would gather the most powerful men in America, and eventually the world, under the banner of Christian fellowship, something visible enough to seem legitimate but vague enough to avoid scrutiny, something that would normalize the idea of religious leaders and political leaders working together closely. He called it the National Prayer Breakfast, and it would become the family's most public face and their most effective tool for influence. The first National Prayer Breakfast happened on February 5, 1953 AD, at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. 400 people attended, including President Dwight Eisenhower, members of Congress from both parties, Supreme Court justices, cabinet secretaries, military leaders, and corporate executives. It looked like a standard Washington event, important people gathering for a meal, some speeches, and networking. But this was different. The breakfast wasn't organized by any church or official religious organization. It was coordinated by Varidi and a small group of family members working through an entity called the International Christian Leadership, later renamed the International Foundation. These entities existed mainly on paper, addresses registered to private homes, no public officers, minimal financial disclosure. The breakfast was presented as non-partisan and non-denominational. There were no specific policy discussions, no legislative agendas, no calls to action on particular issues. Just prayer, a few brief talks about faith and leadership, and the implicit message that America's power elite should see themselves as united by Christian values. President Eisenhower spoke at that first breakfast. His remarks were brief and general, praising faith as the foundation of American strength, calling for spiritual renewal in public life, emphasizing that political differences mattered less than shared belief in God. It was exactly the kind of anodyne religious rhetoric that offends nobody and commits to nothing specific. But Eisenhower's attendance was crucial. It established a precedent that every president since has followed. Not because they're required to attend, the breakfast isn't a government function, but because refusing would create awkward questions. Why wouldn't the president join other leaders in prayer? What's controversial about a breakfast? This was Varidi's genius. He created an event that seemed harmless, even admirable, while serving multiple strategic purposes that had nothing to do with prayer. The breakfast wasn't about prayer, it was about access. Every president since Eisenhower has attended the National Prayer Breakfast. Truman didn't attend because it started after his presidency, but every single one since. Democrat and Republican, liberal and conservative, personally devout and privately skeptical. Kennedy attended, though he was Catholic and the family's theology was distinctly Protestant. Johnson attended during the Vietnam War. Nixon attended before and after Watergate. Carter attended, and he was a genuine evangelical Christian who probably took the spiritual aspect seriously. Reagan attended and gave speeches about America as a Christian nation. Bush attended, Clinton attended, Bush again attended, Obama attended, despite being criticized by some evangelicals for not being Christian enough. Trump attended and gave characteristically rambling, combative speeches that violated the breakfast's supposed spirit of unity. Biden has attended. The event had become a fixture of Washington life, supposedly non-partisan, non-denominational, and harmless. But what most attendees didn't know, and what the public definitely didn't know, was that the family organized and controlled the entire event. They selected the speakers, they set the agenda, they chose who received invitations and who didn't, they facilitated the private meetings that happened around the breakfast, And this is where the real work occurred. The breakfast itself was just the public centerpiece. The real activity happened in the days surrounding the event. Small private dinners, one-on-one meetings, introductions between people who wanted to meet, but couldn't do so through official channels. Foreign dignitaries would visit Washington for the breakfast and stay for private meetings with American politicians. A senator could promise support to a foreign leader without coordinating with the State Department. A corporate executive could discuss business opportunities with a minister from another government without registering as a foreign agent. A defense contractor could network with military officials from countries where America sold weapons. All of this was facilitated by family members who made introductions, arranged dinners, and provided venues for meetings. And because it was all framed as Christian fellowship, it looked innocent. Nobody questioned why a senator was having breakfast with a controversial foreign leader. They were just praying together. Nobody investigated the policy implications. It was spiritual outreach, not lobbying. Nobody demanded transparency about who was meeting with whom. These were private religious gatherings, protected by both social norms about respecting faith and potentially by First Amendment considerations about free exercise of religion. The genius of this approach was that it created a parallel diplomatic and political structure operating outside normal channels and oversight. Official diplomacy involves protocols, records, accountability. When a State Department official meets with a foreign government representative, cables get sent, meetings are documented, decisions are reviewed. Congress can demand testimony, journalists can file Freedom of Information Act requests, historians can eventually examine the archives. Family-facilitated meetings had none of that. A congressman could make promises to a dictator over breakfast, and there'd be no official record. A business deal could be discussed between a corporate executive and a foreign minister, with no disclosure to shareholders or the public. Policy positions could be coordinated among members of Congress who appeared to be making independent decisions, but were actually aligned through their family connections. The National Prayer Breakfast also served another crucial purpose. It normalized the family's theology. Year after year, the most powerful people in America gathered and listened to speakers who emphasized a very specific version of Christianity. Not the social gospel that called for helping the poor, not liberation theology that questioned power structures and sided with the oppressed, not even evangelical Christianity focused on personal salvation and Bible study. Instead, a gospel of leadership. Speakers at the breakfast emphasized that power was a gift from God, that those who wielded power bore special responsibility to shape the world according to divine will, that leaders were chosen not by voters or circumstances, but by God Himself. This message was repeated constantly at family events, but the National Prayer Breakfast made it seem mainstream. If the President of the United States attended an event where such theology was preached, it couldn't be extremist, right? If Supreme Court justices and senators from both parties participated, it must represent legitimate Christian thinking. The breakfast also created a model that was exported globally. The family began helping organize similar events in countries around the world. Prayer breakfasts in capitals across Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Each followed the same format. Bring together political and business elites, frame it as religious fellowship, and build relationships that would later influence policy. In the 1960s, a new figure emerged who would take the family to unprecedented levels of influence. His name was Doug Coe. Coe joined the family in the early 1960s and quickly became Abraham Vereide's protege. When Vereide died in 1969 AD, Coe took over leadership of the organization, though he never used that title. He preferred to call himself a facilitator or simply a friend. Coe was different from Vereide in important ways. Vereide had been a minister, trained in theology, comfortable giving sermons. Coe had no formal theological training and never sought ordination. He presented himself as a layman, just a regular guy who loved Jesus and wanted to help important people follow him. But Coe was charismatic in a quiet, powerful way. He didn't give fiery speeches or write best-selling books. Instead, he worked one-on-one with powerful people, cultivating relationships that lasted decades. He knew how to listen, how to make someone feel understood, how to position himself as a spiritual advisor, without ever seeming to push an agenda. Politicians trusted him because he seemed to want nothing for himself. He lived modestly, not in poverty, but without ostentatious wealth. He never sought public recognition or credit for the family's work. He appeared genuinely devoted to helping leaders find God and use their power wisely. But Coe's private teachings were more extreme than Virides, and they revealed a theological framework that was deeply troubling. Former members who later left the family have reported disturbing patterns in how Coe taught about leadership and commitment. In small group settings, not public speeches, but private meetings with cells, Coe would pose questions designed to provoke thought about absolute commitment. Who built the most effective organization in history? He'd ask. Then he'd answer his own question. Hitler, or Mao, or Pol Pot. He wasn't endorsing their ideologies. Family members would insist on this point when questioned. He was praising their organizational structures. These leaders had created movements where members were completely loyal, willing to do anything for the cause, bound together by something greater than individual interest. They had achieved total commitment from their followers. That kind of commitment, Coe argued, was what Christian leaders needed. Not genocide, obviously, not totalitarianism, but that same intensity of dedication, that same willingness to subordinate everything, family, wealth, personal comfort, even conventional morality, to a higher cause. Coe would tell members that Jesus didn't ask people to be nice. Jesus asked people to forsake everything and follow him absolutely. He demanded that disciples leave their families, abandon their livelihoods, give up any claim to normal life. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. That was the standard. The early Christians faced lions in the Colosseum rather than renounce their faith. They were burned alive, crucified upside down, torn apart by wild animals, and they sang hymns as they died. That was real commitment. Modern Christianity, in Coe's view, had become weak and sentimental. Churches focused on charity and kindness, on being good neighbors and helping those in need. All fine things, Coe would say, but insufficient. They were kindergarten Christianity, milk for babies. What the world needed was meat. Strong Christian leaders who understood power, who were willing to make hard decisions, who didn't flinch from using authority to advance God's kingdom. This is where the family's theology became genuinely dangerous. It wasn't just that they celebrated power. Plenty of Christian traditions do that, arguing that earthly authority ultimately derives from God. What made the family's approach dangerous was that they created a framework where anything a chosen leader did could be justified spiritually. Coe taught extensively about King David. David committed adultery with Bathsheba, not just an affair, but an abuse of power, since as king he could effectively command her presence. Then he had her husband Uriah murdered by arranging for him to be abandoned on the battlefield. These weren't minor sins. This was sexual exploitation and premeditated murder. Yet David remained king. God was angry. The prophet Nathan confronted David, and the child born from the affair died. But David wasn't removed from power. He remained God's anointed, and God continued working through him despite his catastrophic failures. Family members would point to this story as evidence that God forgives his chosen leaders, that their personal failings don't disqualify them from divine purpose. The reasoning showed up again and again when family members faced scandals. When someone was caught in an affair, other members would invoke David. When someone faced corruption charges, they'd talk about how God used flawed people. When someone was accused of abuse of power, they'd frame it as persecution of God's chosen. This created an insular world where normal accountability didn't apply. The rest of the world might condemn a family member for misconduct. The media might attack them. Constituents might demand resignation. But within the family, they remained chosen, which meant they deserved protection and loyalty, not judgment. This wasn't just theological theory. It played out in practical ways that protected powerful people from consequences. When a senator faced an ethics investigation, family members would quietly work to limit the damage. When a congressman admitted to an affair, they'd help manage the public relations response. When a business leader was accused of fraud, Other family members would vouch for his character. And because all of this happened privately, through personal relationships rather than institutional structures, there was no way to hold anyone accountable for enabling bad behavior. Under Coe's leadership, the family also expanded internationally in ways that would produce some of their most controversial relationships. This was where the theology of chosen leaders would intersect with Cold War geopolitics to create catastrophic results. The Cold War gave the family both purpose and cover for unprecedented international expansion. From the late 1940s through the 1980s, American foreign policy was organized around a single principle: contain communism. Every decision, who to support, where to send aid, when to intervene militarily, flowed from this overriding goal. The family aligned perfectly with this mission. They saw communism not just as a political system, but as a spiritual threat, atheistic, materialistic, hostile to religion and traditional values. Fighting communism wasn't just geopolitics, it was spiritual warfare. This framing allowed the family to position their international work as ministry rather than politics. When they facilitated relationships between American politicians and anti-communist leaders abroad, they weren't conducting shadow diplomacy. They were spreading the gospel and supporting Christian leaders facing atheistic oppression. The fact that these Christian leaders were often brutal dictators was secondary to their anti-communist stance. The family began organizing prayer breakfasts and cell groups in countries around the world. They worked through American embassies, connecting with local politicians, military officers, and business leaders who were aligned with US interests. They facilitated visits to Washington for foreign leaders, bringing them to the National Prayer Breakfast and arranging private meetings with American officials. The pattern was consistent across continents. Find a strong leader who claimed Christian faith or could be persuaded to adopt Christian rhetoric, and who opposed communism. Connect them with American politicians and business leaders. Facilitate aid, weapons deals, and diplomatic support. Frame everything as spiritual partnership rather than political alliance. And never worry too much about whether these leaders actually governed according to Christian principles, or any principles at all beyond maintaining power. One of the family's earliest and most consequential international relationships was in South Korea. After World War II, Korea was divided between a communist North and a US-backed South. When war broke out in 1950 AD, America intervened to prevent the South from falling to communism. The war ended in stalemate, with Korea remaining divided and South Korea dependent on American support. Syngman Rhee, South Korea's first president, was a Christian, a Methodist who'd spent years in America before returning to lead his country. He was also increasingly authoritarian. He rigged elections, suppressed opposition, and imprisoned critics. But he was staunchly anti-communist, and that made him valuable. The family cultivated relationships with Rhee and his government. They helped organize prayer breakfasts in Seoul. They brought Korean officials to Washington for the National Prayer Breakfast. They facilitated connections between Korean and American business leaders. When Rhee's government faced criticism for its authoritarian practices, family members in Congress defended him as a Christian leader fighting communism in difficult circumstances. After Rhee was eventually forced from power in 1960 AD following mass protests, the family maintained relationships with subsequent South Korean leaders, including Park Chung-hee, who seized power in a military coup in 1961 AD. Park was a military dictator who suspended civil liberties, imprisoned dissidents, and ruled through martial law. He also presided over rapid economic development that transformed South Korea from an impoverished agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse. For the family, Park represented their ideal, a strong leader who could impose order, drive development, and resist communism. The fact that he did this by suppressing democracy was acceptable, even admirable, because democracy in a country threatened by communism might be a dangerous luxury. This reasoning would be applied repeatedly across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The family's work in Latin America was particularly extensive and troubling. During the 1960s and 1970s, much of Latin America was in turmoil. Popular movements demanding land reform, workers' rights, and social justice were growing. Some were explicitly socialist or communist. Many were simply demanding that oligarchic societies become more democratic and equitable. The US government saw all of this as dangerous, a potential opening for Soviet influence in America's backyard. When Salvador Allende, a democratic socialist, was elected president of Chile in 1970 AD, the Nixon administration worked actively to destabilize his government. In 1973 AD, the Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, overthrew Allende in a coup. Allende died during the coup, either killed or committing suicide. Accounts differ. What followed was 17 years of brutal military dictatorship. Pinochet's regime killed over 3,000 political opponents. Tens of thousands more were tortured. Electric shocks applied to genitals, waterboarding, rape, beatings. People were disappeared, arrested and never seen again, their bodies dumped in mass graves or thrown from helicopters into the ocean. The torture wasn't spontaneous violence. It was systematic, organized, taught to military officers at training centers. Some of that training came from American military advisors, and the family maintained relationships with Pinochet's government. They organized prayer breakfasts in Chile. They facilitated visits by Chilean officials to Washington. Family members in Congress defended Pinochet as a bulwark against communism. When human rights organizations documented atrocities, family-connected politicians argued that reports were exaggerated or that difficult times required difficult measures. Pinochet also implemented free market economic reforms advised by American economists, the so-called Chicago Boys, trained by Milton Friedman. These reforms privatized state industries, cut social spending, and opened Chile to foreign investment. They also created massive inequality and hardship for working people. But for the family and their allies, Chile under Pinochet was a success story. He'd defeated communism, embraced Christianity, at least rhetorically, and implemented capitalist economics. The fact that he'd killed thousands and tortured tens of thousands was regrettable but necessary. This same pattern played out across Latin America. In Guatemala, a CIA-backed coup in 1954 AD had overthrown a democratically elected government attempting land reform. What followed were decades of military rule and civil war. During the 1980s, Guatemala's military conducted what can only be described as genocide against Mayan indigenous communities. Entire villages were massacred, men shot, women raped and killed, children murdered. Over 200,000 people died during Guatemala's civil war, with the vast majority killed by government forces and allied death squads. General Efraín Ríos Montt led the government during some of the worst atrocities. He was also a born-again evangelical Christian. Ríos Montt attended a California megachurch, spoke enthusiastically about his faith, and framed Guatemala's civil war as a spiritual battle between Christianity and communist atheism. The family maintained connections with Ríos Montt. So did other American evangelical organizations. But the family's approach was distinctive, working quietly through political channels rather than public ministry. Family members in Congress defended military aid to Guatemala despite mounting evidence of atrocities. They argued that Ríos Montt was a Christian leader fighting communism in difficult circumstances, that cutting aid would abandon him to his enemies. President Reagan famously said Ríos Montt was getting a bum rap on human rights. This wasn't just ignorance or Cold War realpolitik. American officials knew what was happening. Embassy cables documented massacres. Intelligence reports detailed the military's scorched earth tactics. But supporting Ríos Montt served multiple purposes. It blocked communist influence in Central America. It protected American business interests. And for the family specifically, it demonstrated their theology in action, supporting a chosen Christian leader, regardless of what that leader actually did. In 2013 AD, Ríos Montt was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity by a Guatemalan court. The conviction was later overturned on technical grounds, but the evidence presented at trial was overwhelming. The family never publicly acknowledged any problem with their relationship with him. Similar patterns emerged in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and other Central American countries during the 1980s. These were the years of Reagan's Central America policy, supporting anti-communist forces regardless of their human rights records, providing weapons and training to military governments and right-wing militias. The family was deeply involved in facilitating these relationships. But their most extensive and catastrophic international work happened in Africa. In the 1980s, the family cultivated relationships with some of the most brutal leaders in Africa, not by accident, not out of ignorance, but as a deliberate strategy flowing from their theology of chosen leaders. Africa during the Cold War was a chessboard where superpowers competed for influence. Dozens of countries had gained independence from European colonial rule in the 1960s and 1970s. They inherited arbitrary borders drawn by colonizers, economies designed to extract resources for European benefit, and weak institutions. The Soviet Union offered support to liberation movements and socialist governments. The United States responded by supporting anyone who opposed Soviet influence, including dictators, military juntas, and strongmen whose only qualification was anti-communism. The family saw opportunity in this chaos. If they could establish relationships with African leaders, particularly those willing to adopt Christian language, they could shape the continent's future while advancing American interests. One of their key allies was Siad Barre of Somalia. Barre had seized power in Somalia through a military coup in 1969 AD, establishing what he called scientific socialism. He aligned with the Soviet Union, received military aid and training, and built a Cuban-advised army. Then Somalia invaded Ethiopia in 1977 AD, attempting to seize the Ogaden region where ethnic Somalis lived. Ethiopia was also aligned with the Soviets, which created an awkward situation. Two Soviet client states fighting each other. The USSR eventually sided with Ethiopia, sending massive military aid that crushed Somalia's invasion. Barre, humiliated and desperate, switched sides. He expelled Soviet advisors, broke with the Eastern Bloc, and sought American support. The US government was interested. Somalia's location on the Horn of Africa, controlling access to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, made it strategically valuable. But there was a problem. Barre was a dictator with a terrible human rights record. His regime imprisoned thousands, executed opponents, and used violence to maintain control. His clan-based power structure favored certain groups while marginalizing others, planting seeds for future conflict. Providing open military aid to such a government would create political problems in Washington. Congressional critics, human rights organizations, media scrutiny. This is where the family stepped in. Doug Coe and other family members began meeting with Siad Barre. They encouraged him to adopt Christian rhetoric, not necessarily to convert personally, though that would be ideal, but to speak in ways that would resonate with American evangelical audiences. Barre was pragmatic. He started hosting prayer breakfasts in Mogadishu. He talked about shared values between Somalia and America. He framed his government as defending religious freedom against atheistic communism. And it worked. American politicians who were family members began advocating for aid to Somalia. They framed it not as supporting a dictator, but as helping a fellow leader bring stability to a troubled region and prevent Soviet influence. Congress approved hundreds of millions of dollars in military and economic assistance to Somalia throughout the 1980s. The money propped up Barre's regime for years, and during that time, his government committed massive human rights abuses. In the late 1980s, Barre's military conducted what human rights organizations described as genocide against the Isaaq clan in northern Somalia. Entire cities were bombed indiscriminately, civilians were massacred, wells were poisoned, livestock was slaughtered to create famine. Estimates suggest between 50,000 and 200,000 people were killed. American-supplied weapons were used in these attacks. American military aid sustained the regime conducting them. And family members in Congress continued defending Barre as a strategic ally and Christian friend. When Barre's government finally collapsed in 1991 AD, Somalia descended into civil war that lasted for decades. The state effectively ceased to exist. Warlords carved the country into fiefdoms. Famine killed hundreds of thousands. The chaos eventually gave rise to radical Islamist movements like Al-Shabaab. Somalia remains a failed state today, 30-plus years later. It's not an exaggeration to say that American support, facilitated in significant part by the family, helped extend a brutal dictatorship that created conditions for the country's eventual collapse into anarchy. But Somalia wasn't the only example. The family also built extensive relationships in Uganda, and this story reveals even more about how their theology played out in practice. Uganda had suffered horrifically under Idi Amin from 1971 AD to 1979 AD. Amin's regime killed hundreds of thousands. The exact number remains unknown. Through mass executions, torture, and purges, he expelled the entire Asian population, devastating the economy. He was finally overthrown when Tanzania invaded after Amin tried to annex part of their territory. What followed was chaos, several weak governments, continued violence, economic collapse. Then in 1986, AD, Yoweri Museveni took power after years of guerrilla warfare. Museveni presented himself as a reformer who could bring stability after decades of terror. He was educated, articulate, and understood how to appeal to Western donors. He talked about democracy, economic development, and reconciliation. Western governments were cautiously optimistic. The family was enthusiastic. Doug Coe and other family members began traveling to Uganda regularly in the late 1980s. They organized prayer breakfasts in Kampala. They connected Museveni with American politicians and business leaders. They praised him as a Christian leader bringing moral governance to Africa. For a while, Museveni seemed to justify their faith. His government implemented economic reforms that stabilized the currency and attracted investment. He worked with international organizations on development projects. Uganda became something of a donor darling, a country recovering from violence and building democratic institutions. But Museveni never intended to give up power. In 2005 AD, he pushed through a constitutional amendment, removing term limits that would have forced him from office. He suppressed opposition parties through violence and legal harassment. Elections became increasingly fraudulent. By the 2000s, Uganda was effectively an authoritarian state, dressed in democratic language. And the family continued supporting Museveni. They brought him to the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington multiple times. They facilitated meetings with American officials. They never publicly criticized his authoritarian turn because, in their view, he remained a chosen leader doing God's work. The relationship had consequences beyond politics. In 2009 AD, American evangelical preacher Scott Lively visited Uganda and gave talks warning about homosexuality. Lively was known for extreme views. He'd written a book claiming that gay people caused the Holocaust and that homosexuality destroyed civilizations. In Uganda, he warned that gay activists were trying to recruit children, that homosexuality threatened the family, that tolerating it would bring divine judgment. His words found fertile ground in an already conservative society, but they were amplified by connections between Ugandan politicians and American evangelical networks, including networks that overlapped with the family's sphere of influence. In 2009 AD, a Ugandan politician named David Bahati introduced the anti-homosexuality bill. The initial version was shocking, even by conservative standards. It included the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality, defined as homosexual acts by people with HIV, with minors, or by repeat offenders. It mandated life imprisonment for other homosexual acts. It required citizens to report suspected homosexuals to police or face jail themselves. International outcry was immediate and intense. Human rights organizations condemned the bill. Western governments threatened to cut aid. Even some American evangelicals who opposed homosexuality said the bill went too far. The death penalty provision was eventually removed, but a version of the bill passed in 2014 AD. It was struck down by Uganda's Constitutional Court on procedural grounds, but passed again in 2023 AD in even harsher form. The law effectively criminalized being gay in Uganda. LGBTQ people faced arrest, violence from vigilantes, blackmail, forced conversion therapy. Many fled the country. Those who stayed lived in constant fear. Family members who had relationships with Ugandan leaders said very little publicly about the law. Some claimed they privately opposed it, but they didn't use their influence to stop it. They didn't organize opposition or threaten to withdraw support from politicians who backed the bill. They didn't leverage their relationships with Museveni to prevent him from signing it. Their silence was telling. The family had no problem intervening in foreign politics when it came to supporting anti-communist leaders, or facilitating business deals, or maintaining relationships that served American interests. But when it came to human rights, particularly for people whose identities some family members found theologically problematic, they hid behind rhetoric about not interfering in sovereign nations' affairs. This selective engagement revealed what the family actually prioritized: maintaining relationships with power, regardless of what that power did to vulnerable people. To understand the family, to really grasp how they could support dictators, enable corruption, and facilitate policies that harmed millions while sincerely believing they were doing God's work, you have to understand how they read the Bible. Not the whole Bible, because most Christians would agree on 90% of Scripture's basic message. But the family focused obsessively on specific stories, specific verses, specific themes, and they interpreted those passages in ways that most theologians throughout Christian history would find deeply troubling, if not heretical. Their theology wasn't written down in any comprehensive way. The family never published official doctrine, never produced systematic theology texts, never made public statements of belief that could be scrutinized and debated. Instead, their theology was transmitted orally, in small group settings, through personal mentorship and private teachings. This made it flexible, adaptable, and almost impossible to pin down or refute. But former members who left the family and journalists who investigated it have documented consistent themes in how they taught about power, leadership, and God's will. Start with King David, the figure the family returned to more than any other. David's story dominates the Old Testament. He's the shepherd boy who killed Goliath with a sling and a stone, the warrior who united the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, the king who captured Jerusalem and made it his capital, the poet who supposedly wrote many of the Psalms. Christians see David as an ancestor of Jesus. The Messiah was prophesied to come from David's line. Jews revere him as the greatest king in their history, the standard against which all other leaders are measured. But David's biography includes a chapter that most Sunday school lessons skip over quickly: the story of Bathsheba. David saw her bathing from his palace roof. The text says she was beautiful, and David wanted her. He sent messengers to bring her to him. Now, this detail matters. David was king. When the king sends soldiers to your home saying he wants to see you, you don't really have the option to refuse. So Bathsheba came to the palace, not because she chose to, but because she was summoned by someone who had absolute power over her. David slept with her. She became pregnant. And David had a problem, because Bathsheba was married to Uriah, one of David's loyal soldiers who was away fighting David's wars. David tried to cover it up by bringing Uriah home from the battlefield, hoping he'd sleep with his wife and believe the child was his. But Uriah was honorable. He refused to enjoy his home and his wife while his fellow soldiers were sleeping in tents on the battlefield. So David arranged for Uriah to be placed in the front lines during the next battle, in a position where he'd almost certainly be killed. Uriah died exactly as David intended. David then married Bathsheba, making the whole situation look more legitimate, a king taking care of a widowed woman. According to the Bible, God was furious. The prophet Nathan confronted David with a parable about a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb. David was outraged by the story. Such injustice deserved death. Nathan replied, "You are the man." David had everything: wives, wealth, power, God's blessing. Uriah had one wife, and David took her and killed him. David repented. He wrote Psalm 51 AD, one of the most moving expressions of remorse in Scripture. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." God forgave David. But there were consequences. The child born from the affair with Bathsheba died. Nathan prophesied that violence would never depart from David's house. And that prophecy came true in horrifying ways. David's son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. Another son, Absalom, murdered Amnon in revenge. Absalom later tried to overthrow David and was killed in the rebellion. David's family was torn apart by violence that echoed his own violent abuse of power. For most Christians throughout history, this story has been about the cost of sin, even for great leaders, even when forgiven. It's a cautionary tale about how abusing power destroys not just victims, but perpetrators and everyone around them. It's a reminder that God's forgiveness doesn't erase earthly consequences. But the family read the David story differently. They focused almost exclusively on one detail. David remained king. Yes, he sinned terribly. Adultery and murder, abuse of power in the most literal sense. Yes, he faced consequences, the death of his child, family violence. But God didn't remove him from power. He remained a man after God's own heart. That phrase appears in the book of Acts, centuries after David's death. He remained in the line of the Messiah. Jesus would be called Son of David. His sins didn't disqualify him from being God's chosen leader. This became a template for how the family thought about powerful men who did terrible things. When family members faced scandals, affairs, corruption, abuse of power, other members would invoke David. Look, they'd say, even David committed adultery and murder, yet he remained God's anointed king. Therefore, personal failings don't necessarily disqualify leaders from their divine calling. The logic was explicit. If God continued working through David despite his sins, then God could work through any chosen leader despite their sins. This reasoning has an obvious and catastrophic flaw. It completely misses the point of the David story. The Bible doesn't celebrate David's sins or suggest they were acceptable. It records them as devastating failures with severe consequences. The text presents the violence that consumed David's family as directly connected to his earlier violence against Uriah. God's continued use of David wasn't an endorsement of his behavior. It was a demonstration of divine mercy that forgives truly repentant sinners. David's repentance wasn't private or superficial. He confessed publicly, accepted God's judgment, and spent the rest of his life dealing with the consequences of his actions. The Psalms attributed to him after this incident are filled with anguish and genuine contrition. But the family stripped away all that context. They kept only the part where David remained in power. They turned a story about the cost of sin and the possibility of redemption through genuine repentance into a story about the durability of chosen leadership. And they applied this reading to contemporary situations in ways that protected bad behavior rather than encouraging accountability. When a senator was caught having an affair, family members would counsel him privately but defend him publicly, invoking David. When a businessman was accused of fraud, they'd provide character references, suggesting that flawed men could still be used by God. When a politician abused power, they'd reframe it as the difficult burden of leadership that outsiders couldn't understand, all while completely ignoring the biblical requirement for genuine repentance, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and acceptance of consequences. The family did the same thing with Solomon, David's son, who became king after him. Solomon is famous for wisdom. The story of two women claiming the same baby, with Solomon proposing to cut it in half to determine who was lying, is one of the most recognizable tales in the Bible. Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, the center of Jewish worship. Under his rule, Israel reached its peak of wealth and territorial control. But Solomon also accumulated 700 wives and 300 concubines, according to the biblical account. Many of these marriages were political alliances, princesses from neighboring kingdoms, cementing diplomatic relationships and trade agreements. The Bible explicitly says these marriages led Solomon away from God. His foreign wives brought their gods with them, Ashtoreth, Chemosh, Molech, and Solomon built temples to these gods and eventually worshipped them himself. This was the ultimate betrayal in Israelite theology, idolatry, abandoning the covenant between Israel and the one God who had delivered them from slavery. The text says God was angry, and told Solomon that because of this apostasy, the kingdom would be torn apart after his death. And that's exactly what happened. The United Kingdom of Israel split into two competing kingdoms that never reunited. So the biblical judgment on Solomon is deeply ambiguous and ultimately negative. Yes, he was wise and powerful and built the temple, but he also betrayed God through idolatry, and his betrayal led directly to the collapse of everything David had built. The book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to Solomon late in life, is one long meditation on meaninglessness. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. It reads like the reflections of someone who achieved every worldly success and found it hollow. But the family, again, focused selectively on Solomon's story. They emphasized his wisdom, his wealth, his political savvy in building alliances through strategic marriages. They presented him as a model of effective leadership, someone who understood power dynamics, who built coalitions, who expanded his nation's influence and prosperity. They largely ignored the part about idol worship, God's judgment, and the kingdom's destruction. They ignored the way Solomon's accumulation of wealth and power came at tremendous cost, the forced labor he imposed on Israelites, the heavy taxation that created resentment, the political compromises that diluted Israel's distinct identity. This pattern of selective reading extended throughout the family's approach to Scripture. They would find examples of leaders in the Bible and extract only the parts that validated their worldview while ignoring everything that contradicted it. They did this with Moses, emphasizing his role as lawgiver and leader, while downplaying his 40 years in exile after killing an Egyptian, his initial reluctance to lead, and the fact that God didn't allow him to enter the promised land because of his disobedience. They did it with the Apostle Paul, focusing on his boldness and missionary success while ignoring his teachings about the church as the body of Christ, where everyone has value, his instructions for mutual submission, and his clear statements that spiritual gifts matter more than worldly status. And when they turned to Jesus himself, the family's interpretations became even more strained, because Jesus was categorically not a conventional leader, and his teachings directly contradicted most of what the family believed about power. Jesus was born in a stable to a teenage mother in an occupied country. He grew up as a carpenter's son in an insignificant village. He spent time with the people at the bottom of society: lepers, prostitutes, tax collectors, fishermen, the sick and demon-possessed. He criticized religious authorities and wealthy elites repeatedly and harshly. When his disciples argued about who was greatest, he told them the last would be first and the first would be last. He washed his disciples' feet, a task normally done by the lowest servants, and told them to do the same for each other. When Satan offered him all the kingdoms of the world during his temptation in the wilderness, Jesus refused. When crowds wanted to make him king by force, he withdrew to the mountains alone. His most famous teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, is radically countercultural. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the meek, the persecuted. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Turn the other cheek. Don't store up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy. If someone sues you for your tunic, give them your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles with them. Don't worry about what you'll eat or wear. Look at the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. You cannot serve both God and money. These teachings are so radical that most Christian traditions have struggled throughout history to figure out how to apply them in practice. Some have taken them literally, like the Amish or certain monastic communities, renouncing wealth and power entirely. Others have interpreted them as spiritual principles rather than literal commands. Love your enemies doesn't mean nations can't have armies. It means don't hate the enemy soldier as a person. But however you interpret these teachings, they clearly aren't about celebrating power or validating wealthy leaders. The family essentially ignored all of this. They focused instead on moments where Jesus demonstrated what they called leadership qualities. He selected 12 disciples. That was building an organization, choosing key men. He spoke with authority. The crowds were amazed because he taught as one with authority, not like their scribes and Pharisees. He confronted the religious establishment. He drove money changers from the temple. He called the Pharisees hypocrites and whitewashed tombs. He understood power structures. He navigated Roman occupation and Jewish religious politics skillfully. This required ignoring virtually everything Jesus said about wealth, power, and worldly authority. It required explaining away his clearest statements. When a rich young man asked what he must do to inherit eternal life, Jesus told him to sell everything and give to the poor. The man couldn't do it. He was too attached to his wealth. And Jesus said, "It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." The disciples were astonished. If the rich can't be saved, who can be? Jesus replied, "With man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." The family had to explain this away. They argued that Jesus wasn't really condemning wealth. He was testing the young man's attachment to possessions. The real message, they claimed, was about surrendering to God's will rather than being controlled by material things. And if God's will placed you in a position of wealth and power, then accepting that, stewarding those resources, was actually the right response. Giving everything away might actually be disobedience if God wanted you to use wealth and power for his purposes. This kind of theological gymnastics is common in prosperity gospel movements. Prosperity preachers tell people that faith will make them wealthy, that God wants his children to prosper financially, that poverty is a curse that can be broken through sufficient faith and giving. But the family's theology was different, and in some ways more insidious. They weren't promising that faith would make you rich. They were saying that if you already were rich and powerful, that proved you were chosen by God. It's a subtle but crucial difference. Prosperity gospel is aspirational. It tells poor people they can become wealthy through faith. The family's gospel of leadership was confirmational. It told wealthy people their wealth was evidence of divine favor. Prosperity gospel, at least theoretically, applies to everyone. The family's theology was inherently elitist. It was specifically for those who already held power. They also drew heavily from Paul's letters, particularly Romans chapter 13. "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities," Paul wrote, "for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." This passage has been used throughout history to justify obedience to whatever government happens to be in power. It's been cited by monarchs claiming divine right, by slaveholders defending slavery, by authoritarian regimes demanding submission. But it's worth noting the context in which Paul was writing. He was writing to Christians in Rome, people living under an empire that would eventually persecute them brutally, throwing them to lions and burning them as human torches in Nero's gardens. He was probably offering practical advice for survival. Don't unnecessarily provoke the authorities, pay your taxes, stay out of trouble. Don't give them excuses to crush the young Christian movement. He almost certainly wasn't making a universal theological claim that every government in history, regardless of how evil, was specifically ordained by God to rule. If he had meant that, it would contradict the entire biblical narrative of prophets who challenged kings, of Hebrew midwives who disobeyed Pharaoh's order to kill baby boys, of Daniel who refused to stop praying even when the law forbade it. But the family used Romans 13 to argue that resisting authority was resisting God's plan. If a dictator was in power, God must have put him there. If a corporation controlled vast resources, God must have blessed it. If a politician won election, God must have chosen him for that moment. This theology collapses under the weight of history and basic moral reasoning. Was Hitler ordained by God to rule Germany? Was Stalin ordained to rule the Soviet Union? Were the European colonial powers that enslaved millions of Africans acting according to divine will? Was Pol Pot chosen by God to rule Cambodia and kill a quarter of its population? Most Christians throughout history would say no, that evil exists in the world, that human free will allows terrible choices, that God works redemptively through history but doesn't directly ordain every atrocity, that there's a difference between God allowing something to happen and God actively willing it to happen, that sometimes leaders are in power not because God chose them, but because they seized power through violence, or because broken human systems elevated the wrong people, or because voters made mistakes. The family's answer to these questions was more complicated and evasive. They acknowledged that bad leaders existed, that evil was real. But they also believed that if you could get close to any leader, even a brutal one, you might redirect them toward better choices through personal relationship and spiritual influence. And in the meantime, you should still respect their authority and work with them rather than opposing them. This is where the theology became a tool for political convenience rather than genuine religious conviction. If you believed that all authority came from God and that leaders should be supported rather than opposed, then it became very easy to justify working with whoever happened to be in power, regardless of their policies, their human rights records, or their character. You could support both American democracy and foreign dictatorships without cognitive dissonance. You weren't being hypocritical. You were recognizing that God worked through different political systems in different places according to his mysterious purposes. You could facilitate relationships between American politicians and authoritarian leaders abroad, while claiming you were just building bridges for potential gospel influence. You could support policies that hurt vulnerable people, while claiming those policies served some higher purpose that outsiders couldn't see. The family's theology also emphasized personal relationships over institutional structures in a way that sounds appealing but has dangerous implications. They believed that changing individual leaders was more effective than changing laws, systems, or institutions. If you could get a president or prime minister to embrace Christian principles personally, that would do more good than passing 100 pieces of legislation. If you could influence a CEO's heart, that would help workers more than unions or labor laws. If you could guide a general toward godly decisions, that would protect civilians better than international humanitarian law. There's something superficially appealing about this idea. Laws can be enforced badly, ignored selectively, or twisted to serve the powerful. Institutions can become corrupt, bureaucratic, captured by special interests. But if a leader truly internalized values like compassion, justice, humility, and service, those values might guide their decisions in ways no law or institution could mandate. The problem is that this almost never works in practice. People are complicated and contradictory. Someone can sincerely believe they're following God while making choices that devastate millions. George W. Bush reportedly prayed every morning, read the Bible regularly, and saw himself as a man of faith. But he launched a war in Iraq based on faulty intelligence that killed hundreds of thousands of people and destabilized an entire region. Jimmy Carter was deeply devout, taught Sunday school, lived simply, but even his presidency included policies in Central America and support for leaders that contributed to violence. Personal piety doesn't guarantee wise governance, and it certainly doesn't prevent the abuse of power. What prevents abuse of power is accountability, systems that check leaders, rules that constrain choices, transparency that exposes wrongdoing. And the family's model had no mechanism for real accountability. If a leader made terrible decisions, family members might counsel them privately in their cell meetings. But they wouldn't publicly oppose them, wouldn't organize resistance, wouldn't support alternative candidates, or work to remove them from power. Loyalty to chosen leaders superseded everything else, including the actual well-being of people affected by those leaders' decisions. This created a system where power was always validated, never meaningfully challenged, where leaders could do almost anything and still count on support from their family brothers, where the only real accountability came from within the elite circle itself, and that accountability was more about managing perception than demanding genuine change. One of the most disturbing aspects of family theology was how they treated suffering and inequality. In most Christian traditions throughout history, suffering is something to be alleviated and opposed. Jesus healed the sick, fed the hungry, welcomed outcasts, and commanded his followers to care for the least of these. The early church shared possessions so no one would be in need. Medieval monasteries ran hospitals and hospices. The social gospel movement built settlement houses and fought for workers' rights. Liberation theology sided with the poor and oppressed against unjust structures. Churches across traditions run food banks, homeless shelters, medical clinics, addiction recovery programs, and refugee resettlement services. This is seen as basic Christian duty, caring for those who are suffering because Christ is present in them. The family didn't really do any of that. They occasionally mentioned caring for the poor in their public statements, but it was always secondary to their focus on leaders. They devoted vastly more energy to cultivating relationships with senators and CEOs than to serving people in poverty. And there was a disturbing strain in their thinking that suggested poverty and suffering might be spiritually necessary or even divinely ordained. If God ordained leaders to be in positions of power and authority, the logic went, didn't that imply he also ordained social hierarchies more broadly? If some people were chosen to rule, didn't that mean others were chosen to be ruled? The family never said this explicitly. It would sound too much like defending oppression. But the logical implication was hard to escape from their theology. They also taught that leaders faced unique spiritual challenges that deserved special attention and support. The pressures of power, the difficult decisions, the weight of responsibility, the loneliness of command, these were presented as a kind of suffering that was particularly important. Leaders needed prayer, support, spiritual counsel to help them bear these burdens. They deserved spaces where they could be vulnerable, where they could admit doubt without appearing weak, where they could find fellowship with others who understood the unique challenges of wielding power. In other words, the family was more concerned about the spiritual well-being of senators and CEOs than about people living in poverty, facing violence, or lacking basic necessities. This was a complete inversion of biblical priorities. The prophets in the Old Testament spent far more time condemning leaders who oppressed the poor than comforting those leaders about the burdens of power. Amos thundered against those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth. Isaiah denounced leaders who turn aside the needy from justice and rob the poor of my people of their right. Jeremiah declared judgment on those who built their houses by unrighteousness and their upper rooms by injustice, who make their neighbors serve them for nothing and do not give them their wages. Jesus declared, "Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation." James wrote, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you." The consistent biblical pattern is challenging power, warning against wealth, siding with the vulnerable, demanding justice for the oppressed. The family inverted all of this, celebrating power, validating wealth, focusing on the needs of leaders while paying minimal attention to those suffering under their rule. Understanding this theology helps explain how the family could operate for decades without apparent self-doubt or moral crisis. They weren't cynical operators hiding behind religion to pursue power. They were true believers in a worldview that made their actions not only acceptable, but divinely mandated. When they facilitated relationships with dictators, they genuinely believed they were creating opportunities for gospel influence that might gradually reform those leaders. When they protected members facing scandals, they genuinely believed they were showing Christian grace to flawed but chosen leaders. When they supported policies that hurt vulnerable people, they genuinely believed those policies served some higher purpose in God's plan. This makes them more dangerous than simple hypocrites would be. Hypocrites can be exposed and their duplicity revealed. But true believers don't see their contradictions. They've constructed a theological framework where everything they do makes perfect sense, where all evidence can be interpreted to support their pre-existing convictions. And when that theological framework validates power rather than checking it, when it celebrates leaders rather than holding them accountable, when it sees success as evidence of divine favor rather than questioning how that success was achieved, then faith becomes power's most effective weapon against accountability. The family's theology represents a profound corruption of Christianity, not corruption in the sense of conscious evil or deliberate deception, but corruption in the sense of taking something that was meant to challenge power and twisting it into something that serves power. Taking a religion founded by a man who died on a Roman cross and turning it into a religion that celebrates Roman centurions. Taking teachings about the last being first and the meek inheriting the earth, and reinterpreting them to mean that those who are already first and powerful must be chosen by God. This theological corruption had real-world consequences that we can measure and document. Dictators sustained in power, atrocities enabled, vulnerable people harmed. But it also represents something deeper and more dangerous: the capacity of religion to justify anything when it loses its prophetic edge and becomes a tool for power's self-justification. At 133 C Street Southeast in Washington, D.C., just 3 blocks from the Capitol building, sits an elegant brick townhouse built in 1890 AD. From the outside, it looks unremarkable, one of many historic row houses in this neighborhood of tree-lined streets and federal workers. But for decades, this house served as the family's most visible headquarters and a residence for members of Congress. The arrangement was unusual from the very beginning. The house was technically owned by a religious organization, which meant it was tax-exempt despite sitting on prime Capitol Hill real estate worth millions. Because it was registered as a church, it paid no property taxes that other homeowners in the neighborhood had to pay. Members of Congress could live there for remarkably low rent. In the 2000s, when similar houses in the neighborhood rented for $3,000 to $4,000 per month, congressmen at C Street paid around $600. This below-market rent was essentially a financial benefit worth thousands of dollars annually from a religious organization to sitting legislators. They called it a Christian fellowship house rather than a political residence. This framing created several interconnected ethical and legal problems that would eventually explode into public scandal. First, congressmen were receiving what amounted to a substantial gift from an organization that had clear political interests and connections. The rent subsidy, the difference between market rate and what they actually paid, should arguably have been reported as a gift under congressional ethics rules. But because the family wasn't officially a lobbying group and framed everything as religious ministry, the rules were ambiguous enough that they could argue no violation occurred. Second, the house became a place where politicians lived together, prayed together, ate meals together, and inevitably discussed policy together. This created an informal caucus that operated outside normal party structures and completely outside public accountability. Members didn't call themselves a voting bloc, didn't issue joint statements, didn't acknowledge coordinating in any official way, but they met regularly in private, shared the same theological framework about power and leadership, and developed close personal relationships that naturally influenced their political decisions. Constituents back home had no idea that their representatives were part of this network. Third, the House facilitated meetings with foreign officials, lobbyists, corporate executives, and other politically interested parties who visited Washington. Because it was technically a private residence rather than an official government building or congressional office, meetings held there weren't subject to the same disclosure requirements. A congressman could meet with a foreign leader seeking aid or trade agreements, and there would be no public record of the meeting. A senator could discuss legislation with a corporate lobbyist whose company stood to gain or lose millions, and constituents would never know the meeting happened. All of this could be framed as private religious fellowship, rather than political activity requiring disclosure or oversight. For years, this arrangement received almost no media attention despite operating in the heart of the nation's capital. The family actively discouraged members from talking about the house or their involvement with the organization. When journalists did occasionally ask questions, residents gave vague answers about prayer groups, spiritual fellowship, and private religious practice. The house operated in plain sight, but remained functionally invisible to public scrutiny. The arrangement seemed perfect, until 2009 AD, when a series of sex scandals exposed C Street to unprecedented public attention. Senator John Ensign of Nevada was the first domino to fall, and his scandal revealed just how thoroughly the family protected powerful members, even when they violated the very values they publicly championed. Ensign was everything Republican strategists dreamed of in a candidate. He was handsome, articulate, successful in business before entering politics. He'd built a chain of veterinary hospitals before running for Congress. He projected family values, spoke openly about his Christian faith, and positioned himself as a moral conservative. He'd even called for President Clinton's resignation during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, declaring that leaders who violated marriage vows couldn't be trusted with public responsibilities. He was mentioned frequently as a potential presidential candidate. He was also a resident of C Street and a committed member of the family's network. In June 2009 AD, Ensign held a press conference where he admitted to an extramarital affair with Cynthia Hampton, the wife of Doug Hampton, one of Ensign's closest friends and his senior aide. The affair had lasted for months in 2007 and 2008. Both families had been close friends for years. They attended the same church, socialized together, went on trips together. Doug Hampton had worked for Ensign for years and considered him a mentor, friend, and fellow believer. The betrayal was devastating on every level: personal, professional, spiritual. But the scandal became even messier when details emerged about how the affair was handled once Doug Hampton discovered it. Other members of the family living at C Street had known about the affair for months before it became public. Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas, and Representative Bart Stupak of Michigan, all C Street residents, knew about Ensign's affair and counseled him about it. They prayed with him, urged him to end the relationship, and tried to help him manage the situation. But they also facilitated negotiations with Doug Hampton that looked suspiciously like financial compensation for silence. Ensign's parents, wealthy casino owners from Las Vegas, gave the Hampton family $96,000 shortly after the affair was discovered. This was characterized as a gift motivated by compassion for friends going through a difficult time. But the timing was suspicious, and Doug Hampton later claimed it was essentially hush money to keep him from going public about the affair and the way Ensign had abused his position of power. There were other problems too. After Doug Hampton discovered the affair and confronted Ensign fired Hampton from his Senate staff. Then Ensign helped Hampton get work as a lobbyist, connecting him with companies that wanted to lobby Ensign's office. But there's a federal law specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of arrangement. Senior Senate staff are prohibited from lobbying their former boss for 1 year after leaving their position. Hampton started lobbying Ensign's office almost immediately, and Ensign's remaining staff cooperated, taking meetings and helping facilitate the business Hampton was seeking. This violated federal law. When Hampton eventually went to authorities claiming Ensign had broken the law and demanding justice, multiple investigations began. The Senate Ethics Committee investigated, the FBI investigated, the Justice Department considered criminal charges. The details that emerged painted a disturbing picture of Ensign using his position, his resources, and his family connections to manage the fallout from his affair. Family members had helped facilitate the financial payment to the Hamptons. They'd provided counsel that seemed designed more to protect Ensign's career than to ensure genuine accountability or care for the people he'd hurt. They'd invoked the King David defense. Yes, he sinned, but David sinned worse and remained king, so Ensign shouldn't have to resign from the Senate. Ensign eventually resigned in May 2011 AD rather than face the Ethics Committee report that was about to be released. The report, when it came out after his resignation, was devastating. It documented how Ensign had violated multiple federal laws, abused his office, and lied repeatedly to investigators. But the scandal had already accomplished something crucial. It exposed C Street and the family to unprecedented public scrutiny. Journalists started digging into who else lived at the house and what other scandals might be lurking beneath the surface. What they found was a pattern of powerful men who preached family values publicly while privately violating those values, and a network that protected them when they got caught. Governor Mark Sanford of South Carolina provided another dramatic example that same summer. In June 2009 AD, the exact same month Ensign's affair became public, Sanford disappeared for several days. His staff told media he was hiking the Appalachian Trail, taking some time alone to clear his head and make decisions about his political future. His wife Jenny said she didn't know where he was, a statement that later turned out to be true. He was actually in Argentina with his mistress, a journalist named Maria Belén Chapur, whom he'd been seeing for over a year. When Sanford returned to South Carolina and the truth came out, he held one of the most bizarre press conferences in American political history. He rambled emotionally for 18 minutes, admitting the affair while also calling Shapur his soulmate and talking about how much he loved her. He seemed more concerned about his relationship with his mistress than about his wife, his 4 sons, or his duties as governor. It emerged that Sanford was closely connected to the family and had been for years. He'd attended family events regularly, visited C Street, and built relationships with the organization's leaders. Family members, including those at C Street, had known about his affair for months before it became public. They'd counseled him to end it, prayed with him about it, and urged him to recommit to his marriage. But they never went public, never pressured him to resign, never insisted that he face real consequences for betraying his wife and abandoning his duties to pursue an extramarital relationship. Instead, they provided private support while he continued the affair and continued governing, and lying to his wife, his staff, and the public about where he was and what he was doing. Sanford survived calls for his resignation and completed his term as governor, though he was censured by the state legislature and his political career seemed finished. But years later, he ran for Congress and won, staging a political comeback that was remarkable given how spectacularly he'd humiliated himself and his family. The fact that he could resurrect his career says something about how the political system, and particularly conservative Christian political networks, handles scandal among their own. Representative Chip Pickering of Mississippi was another C Street resident whose marriage ended amid allegations of infidelity connected to the house. After Pickering left Congress in 2009 AD, his ex-wife Leisha sued him, alleging he'd carried on a long-term affair with another woman while still married to her. The lawsuit claimed that some of the affair had been conducted at the C Street house and that C Street residents and family members knew about the affair and provided cover for it. The lawsuit alleged that the family and C Street had effectively functioned as infrastructure supporting Pickering's adultery, providing a place where he could meet his mistress away from prying eyes, and a community that would keep his secret. The case was eventually settled out of court with terms that remain confidential. But it added to the pattern emerging from these scandals. C Street wasn't just a residence, it was a place where powerful men felt protected from the normal consequences of their actions. These scandals revealed something deeply troubling about how the family operated and what that revealed about their actual values versus their stated beliefs. The issue wasn't just hypocrisy, though the hypocrisy was stunning. Politicians who'd built careers on defending traditional marriage and family values, who'd condemned Bill Clinton for his affair, who'd portrayed themselves as paragons of Christian morality, caught in sordid affairs themselves. That kind of hypocrisy is depressingly common in politics and in religious communities. The deeper problem was how the family responded to these scandals and what that revealed about their theology and practice. Rather than encouraging genuine accountability, they provided cover and damage control. Rather than calling members to real repentance, which would mean accepting consequences, making restitution to people they'd hurt, and stepping away from power while they dealt with their failures, they helped manage public relations while protecting members' positions. Rather than acknowledging that these men had disqualified themselves from leadership through serious moral failure, they framed the affairs as spiritual struggles that didn't diminish their divine calling to lead. And they repeatedly invoked the King David defense. Yes, these men had committed adultery, but David committed adultery and murder, yet God still used him, still loved him, still called him a man after God's own heart. Therefore, these contemporary leaders' sins didn't mean they weren't still chosen by God to hold power and shape policy. This reasoning created what economists call a moral hazard, a situation where people are protected from the consequences of risky behavior, which then encourages more risky behavior. If you tell powerful men they're chosen by God and that their personal failings don't diminish their calling, you remove one of the key guardrails that keeps people honest, the fear of consequences. If you create a community that will support and protect members who face scandal, you're incentivizing people to take risks they otherwise wouldn't. If you frame accountability as persecution and consequences as attacks on God's chosen, you make it psychologically impossible for people to learn from their mistakes or change their behavior. One former family member described it perfectly in an interview after leaving the organization. The family created an environment where powerful men felt entitled to special treatment and special forgiveness. They were told constantly that they were chosen, that they were key men, that God had placed them in positions of power for His purposes. They were surrounded by other powerful men who reinforced this message and who would protect them if they got in trouble. And they were taught a theology that said their sins didn't disqualify them from leadership because God uses flawed people. All of this together created perfect conditions for bad behavior. The C Street scandals also revealed how the house functioned as a political operation disguised as ministry, which raised serious questions about its tax-exempt status. The IRS grants tax exemptions to religious organizations because they're supposed to serve public benefit through worship, religious education, charity, and community service. Churches are exempt from property taxes, their donations are tax-deductible, and their income isn't taxed, all because society has decided that religion serves the common good in ways that justify these financial benefits. But tax filings and media investigations showed that C Street didn't really operate like a church. There were no regular religious services open to the public or even to a broader congregation. There was no pastoral care for a community beyond the politicians who lived there or visited. There was no charitable work serving the poor, the sick, or the vulnerable. There was no religious education for children or adults in the neighborhood. What there was, a residence for a small group of politicians who shared similar conservative views, who met regularly to discuss strategy and coordinate positions, who used their shared religious identity to build political alliances. This looked much more like a political clubhouse than a church. Critics argued forcefully that this should disqualify the house from tax-exempt status. If it was really a church, it should function as a church, holding worship services, serving a community, doing the kinds of things that justify tax exemption. If it was actually a political residence being used for strategic coordination among members of Congress, it should pay property taxes like any other residence or office space. The IRS did investigate these concerns after the scandals brought public attention to C Street's unusual status. But they ultimately took no action, and the house retained its tax exemption. The legal standards for what constitutes a church are murky and somewhat subjective, and the family had always been skilled at operating in grey areas where rules were ambiguous enough to avoid clear violations while still bending the spirit of the law. The family also faced intensified questions about financial transparency, or the complete lack thereof. Because they operated through multiple small entities rather than one large organization, and because they weren't registered as a lobbying group, they faced minimal disclosure requirements. Money flowed into various family-connected foundations and non-profits from wealthy donors. That money funded the National Prayer Breakfast, paid for international trips where politicians met with foreign leaders, covered operating costs for C Street, and supported various other activities. But there was no comprehensive public accounting of who was giving how much money or exactly how that money was being spent. This created obvious opportunities for what amounts to legalized corruption. A wealthy businessman could donate significant sums to the family's foundations. That money might help fund trips where members of Congress met with foreign leaders the businessman wanted to do business with, or it might fund events where the businessman could network directly with politicians in informal settings, or it might support the operations of C Street where congressmen lived at below-market rates and discussed policy in private. Was this lobbying? By any reasonable definition, yes. Was it being disclosed and regulated like lobbying? No, because it was all wrapped in religious language and rooted through entities claiming religious purpose. This allowed the family to facilitate relationships between donors and politicians, between business interests and government officials, between foreign leaders and American lawmakers, all outside the normal disclosure and oversight systems designed to prevent corruption. One journalist who'd investigated the family for years and whose work brought much of this to public attention was Jeff Charlotte. Charlotte's involvement with the family was unusual, and gave his reporting unique credibility. He'd actually lived at a family property before he became a reporter investigating them. In 2002 AD, when Charlotte was a young writer trying to figure out his career, he was invited to spend time at a house in Arlington, Virginia, called Ivanwald. Ivanwald was operated by the family as a kind of training ground for young men. It was presented as a discipleship house where young Christians could grow in their faith while serving and learning from older, successful Christian men who were part of the family's network. Residents performed manual labor for family members, yard work, household repairs, cleaning. They attended Bible studies and prayer meetings. They were taught about leadership, power, and what it meant to be a man of God in positions of influence. But according to Charlotte's later accounts, what he experienced at Ivanwald was disturbing in ways he didn't fully recognize until after he left. The atmosphere was designed to break down independent thinking and critical questioning. Residents were encouraged to see themselves primarily as servants, not servants of God in the abstract, but servants of the powerful men they worked for and would one day work alongside. Humility was defined as submitting to authority without questioning. Strength was defined as the ability to make hard decisions without being troubled by doubt or empathy for those hurt by those decisions. They read books and had discussions about leaders who'd built powerful, effective organizations, and Hitler came up repeatedly in these discussions, not as a monster whose example should be rejected, but as an organizational genius whose methods could be studied and learned from. The mentors at Ivanwald would ask, how did Hitler create such intense loyalty among his followers? How did he build a movement where people would die for the cause? What organizational principles allowed him to reshape an entire society in just a few years? The point, they'd always clarify, wasn't to endorse Hitler's ideology or goals. The point was to learn from his effectiveness, his ability to inspire total commitment, his understanding of how to build and wield power. Christian leaders needed that same intensity and effectiveness, just directed toward godly purposes instead of evil ones. Residents at Ivanwald were also taught that traditional democratic values were less important than having the right leaders in charge. Democracy could be messy, inefficient, vulnerable to manipulation by demagogues or control by an ignorant masses. What the world needed was strong leaders who submitted to God's authority and had the courage to implement His will even when it was unpopular or controversial. Such leaders might need to operate outside or above democratic constraints to accomplish God's purposes. After leaving Ivanwald, Charlotte spent years researching and reporting on the family. He published a book in 2008 AD that exposed the organization to unprecedented public attention, documenting their history, theology, international connections, and influence on American politics. The book was controversial and generated intense reactions. Family members and their defenders argued that Charlotte had misunderstood what he witnessed, taken quotes out of context, and portrayed a benign religious fellowship as a sinister conspiracy. They insisted the family was simply about helping powerful people follow Jesus, nothing more, nothing less. But Charlotte's reporting was corroborated by other former members who'd left the family and been willing to speak publicly despite the personal cost. Multiple sources independently confirmed the discussions about Hitler and other authoritarian leaders as organizational models. Multiple sources confirmed the theology that elevated chosen leaders above normal accountability. Multiple sources confirmed the deliberate secrecy, the international connections with dictators, and the belief that influencing powerful individuals mattered more than democratic processes or human rights. When Charlotte's book was published, the family largely refused to engage with it publicly or respond to specific allegations. Doug Coe, who led the family for decades, had given very few interviews throughout his entire life and continued that pattern. When he did occasionally speak to reporters, he was charming, warm, and completely evasive. He'd talk about loving Jesus, serving others, bringing people together across divisions, but he consistently refused to give straight answers about the organization's finances, political activities, connections to controversial foreign leaders, or specific beliefs and practices. His approach with journalists was the same as with politicians: build a personal relationship, make them like you as an individual, deflect their harder questions with folksy anecdotes and professions of simple faith. It often worked remarkably well. Reporters would come away from conversations with Coe thinking he seemed like a genuinely kind person who probably wasn't hiding anything particularly sinister, just a man who loved Jesus and wanted to help people. Other family members followed the same playbook when questioned by media. If pressed about relationships with dictators, they'd say they were showing Christian love to everyone, even difficult people, that Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners. If asked about their political influence, they'd claim they had none. They were just praying together, building friendships, trying to help people follow Jesus in their professional lives. If confronted with their extreme theology, the Hitler references, the King David defense, the belief in chosen leaders, they'd insist critics were misunderstanding, taking things out of context, or imposing sinister interpretations on innocent statements. This defensive strategy was remarkably effective for a long time. Because the family had no official membership list, no public platform, no clear organizational structure that could be targeted, it was almost impossible to hold them accountable for anything specific. Every scandal or media expose would create a brief flurry of attention and then fade as journalists struggled to find a clear target or pin down concrete wrongdoing beyond the general troubling pattern. The C Street scandals generated more sustained attention than anything before because they involved sex, prominent politicians, and clear ethical violations. But even that attention eventually faded from mainstream news cycles. Some politicians quietly distanced themselves from the family after the scandals. A few residents moved out of C Street, though the house continued operating. The National Prayer Breakfast continued happening every year, though it faced more questions and criticism than before. And the basic structure remained intact. Cells still meeting privately across Washington and around the country, relationships still forming between powerful people under religious cover, influence still flowing through personal networks that operated almost entirely outside public view. The family had survived exposure once again, as they'd survived every previous challenge to their operations over 7 decades. Doug Coe died on February 21st, 2017 AD at the age of 88. He'd led the family for nearly 50 years, expanding its reach across continents while maintaining the culture of secrecy that had always defined the organization. His death marked the end of an era, but not the end of the organization he'd built and shaped. By the time Coe passed away, the family faced a very different landscape than the one Abraham Vereide had navigated in the 1930s, or even the one Coe had worked in during the Cold War decades. The world had changed in fundamental ways that created both challenges and opportunities for the family's model of influence. The Cold War was over, removing the anti-communist rationale that had justified so many questionable relationships with authoritarian leaders abroad. Media scrutiny had increased dramatically, with books, investigative journalism, documentaries, and the internet making it harder to maintain the kind of total secrecy the family had enjoyed for decades. American Christianity itself was changing in ways that complicated the family's message and appeal. Younger evangelicals were less interested in political power and more focused on issues like poverty, racial justice, immigration reform, and environmental stewardship. Many were leaving evangelical churches entirely, disillusioned by what they saw as the marriage between faith and partisan politics, the defense of leaders whose behavior contradicted Christian values, and the prioritization of political wins over genuine discipleship. Yet, the family adapted to these changes as they'd always adapted to changing circumstances. They maintained the National Prayer Breakfast, though attendance from some foreign leaders dropped after exposés about the organization's history and connections. They continued operating C Street despite increased scrutiny and some prominent members choosing to live elsewhere. They kept building relationships with powerful people, though more carefully and quietly than in previous decades. Leadership passed to a younger generation that included Coe's son David and others who'd been mentored within the organization for years. This new leadership spoke somewhat differently than their predecessors. They talked less about Hitler and authoritarian organizational models. Those references had created too much negative publicity and were too easily misunderstood or criticized. They emphasized service and humility more explicitly in their public statements, though the basic theology of chosen leaders remained largely unchanged. They maintained that the family was simply about helping leaders integrate their faith with their public responsibilities. Nothing conspiratorial, nothing sinister, just fellowship and mutual support. What became increasingly clear in the 21st century was that the family represented something larger and more significant than just one organization. They were part of a broader Christian nationalist movement that had been building strength for decades and was reaching a critical moment in American history. Christian nationalism, the belief that America is fundamentally a Christian nation that should be governed according to Christian principles, has deep roots in American culture going back to the Puritan settlers. The Puritans saw themselves as building a city on a hill that would be a model Christian society for the world. Throughout American history, political leaders have invoked God's blessing on the nation and described America's role in the world in quasi-religious terms. But Christian nationalism intensified dramatically in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as some conservative Christians reacted to cultural changes they found deeply threatening. Secularization seemed to be weakening Christianity's role in public life. Supreme Court decisions had removed mandatory prayer from public schools, legalized abortion, and eventually legalized same-sex marriage. Social movements were demanding equal rights and recognition for groups that conservative Christians often saw as challenging biblical morality: women seeking full equality, LGBTQ people demanding acceptance, religious minorities expecting equal treatment. To many conservative Christians, these changes felt like an assault on their faith and their vision of America. Christian nationalism offered a response: reassert Christianity's central role in American identity, governance, and culture. Different groups pursued this goal through different strategies and with varying degrees of extremism. Some wanted America declared a Christian nation legally, perhaps through constitutional amendment or judicial reinterpretation. Some focused on cultural influence through media, entertainment, education, and business. Some worked to elect sympathetic politicians who would advance Christian values through legislation, executive action, and judicial appointments. The family's approach was distinctive, but aligned with these broader Christian nationalist goals. They didn't organize mass movements, stage rallies, or launch public campaigns like some other Christian nationalist groups. They worked quietly through personal relationships with elites, believing that changing leaders was more effective and more achievable than changing mass culture or democratic institutions. But they shared the fundamental Christian nationalist conviction that America had a special divine purpose, and that Christian leaders, defined as those who shared their particular theological and political views, should shape the nation accordingly. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 AD presented a fascinating and revealing test case for the family's theology and for Christian nationalism more broadly. Trump was not personally religious in any traditional or recognizable sense. He rarely attended church services. He couldn't quote scripture with any facility. When asked about his favorite Bible verse, he couldn't name one. He'd been married 3 times. He'd bragged about sexual conquests in vulgar terms. He was caught on tape making crude comments about groping women. He'd run businesses that engaged in dubious practices, faced thousands of lawsuits, declared bankruptcy multiple times, and been accused of not paying contractors for work they'd completed. He showed little interest in the poor or vulnerable, openly mocked disabled people, spoke about immigrants in dehumanizing terms, and displayed constant vindictiveness toward anyone who criticized him. By almost any traditional Christian standard of character and conduct, humility, honesty, compassion, sexual morality, care for the vulnerable, Trump seemed like an unlikely champion for Christian values. Yet white evangelical Christians supported him at higher rates than they'd supported any recent presidential candidate, including candidates who were personally devout and publicly committed to their faith. They overlooked or actively excused his behavior because he promised to deliver on their political priorities. He would appoint conservative judges who might overturn Roe v. Wade, He would defend religious freedom, defined primarily as protecting conservative Christians' right to operate according to their beliefs, even when those beliefs conflicted with anti-discrimination laws. He would take a hard line on immigration, support Israel unquestioningly, and fight against what they saw as secular progressive cultural dominance. The family's response to Trump was more muted and private than that of some high-profile evangelical leaders who enthusiastically endorsed him. Trump attended the National Prayer Breakfast during his presidency, as every president does. It's essentially a requirement of the office. His speeches there were characteristically rambling, self-centered, and sometimes divisive. At the 2020 AD breakfast, shortly after his impeachment trial, he used the platform to attack his political enemies, mock Nancy Pelosi, who was sitting nearby, and complain about how unfairly he'd been treated. This violated the prayer breakfast's supposed spirit of unity and reconciliation across partisan divides. But family members who were Republicans generally supported Trump, or at least didn't publicly oppose him. Those who had private concerns about his behavior, character, or fitness for office mostly kept those concerns private, maintaining the family's tradition of working behind the scenes rather than taking public political stances. What the family notably didn't do was publicly question whether Trump's behavior and character disqualified him from leadership or made him unsuitable to wield power. This made perfect sense within their theological framework. If leaders were chosen by God, as evidenced by their attainment of power, then personal failings were essentially irrelevant to their divine calling and purpose. King David committed adultery and murder, yet remained God's chosen king. Therefore, Trump's well-documented moral failures, his vindictiveness, his dishonesty, his treatment of women, none of this meant God wasn't working through him to accomplish divine purposes. This reasoning frustrated and angered many Christians who held different theological views about leadership, character, and power. They saw Trump as embodying the opposite of what Jesus taught: boastful rather than humble, vindictive rather than forgiving, divisive rather than reconciling, obsessed with power and status rather than service. They believed that supporting him, or even staying silent about his behavior, represented a profound betrayal of Christian values in service of political expediency. But for the family and similar groups operating from a theology of chosen leaders, consistency required supporting whoever held power, or at minimum, not publicly opposing them. The Trump era also exposed and accelerated deeper tensions within American evangelicalism that had been building for years. Younger evangelicals in particular increasingly questioned the close relationship between their faith and conservative Republican politics. They saw churches and Christian organizations becoming partisan institutions, more interested in Supreme Court appointments and tax policy than in serving the poor, welcoming immigrants, pursuing racial justice, or protecting creation. They saw Christian leaders defending or excusing behavior from political allies that they would never tolerate in their own churches or families. Many began leaving evangelical churches entirely, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed Christianity was supposed to be about. The family represented everything these critics opposed about contemporary evangelicalism: secret influence operating outside democratic accountability, celebration of power rather than service to the powerless, theology twisted to justify whatever powerful people did, no transparency, no public accountability, no willingness to speak prophetic truth to power when power acted unjustly. In 2019 AD, Netflix released a 5-part documentary series about the family based on Jeff Charlotte's reporting and years of additional research. The series brought unprecedented attention to the organization from a mass audience. Millions of Americans who'd never heard of the family suddenly learned about their history, their theology, their connections to authoritarian leaders abroad, and their influence on American politics through the National Prayer Breakfast and other channels. The documentary included interviews with former members who described their experiences, archival footage and documents, and analysis from historians, religious scholars, and journalists. It presented the family not as a harmless prayer group, but as a secretive organization with troubling ideology and real political power operating outside normal democratic oversight. The response was predictably polarized. Critics and those concerned about Christian nationalism saw the documentary as finally exposing a shadow network that had operated with impunity for too long. They argued it demonstrated the dangers of mixing religious authority with political power when that mixing happens in secret, without accountability. Defenders argued the series was biased, sensationalized, and represented an attack on Christians' right to participate in politics. They insisted the family was being unfairly targeted for doing what religious people have always done, trying to bring moral perspective to political questions and supporting each other in living out their faith in professional contexts. Some politicians quietly distanced themselves from the family after the documentary aired and generated negative publicity. Others doubled down, arguing that the criticism proved that secular forces were trying to drive faith from public life entirely. The National Prayer Breakfast faced more scrutiny and criticism than ever before in its nearly 70-year history. Some called for it to be discontinued entirely, or at least reorganized under different management, with full transparency about funding, decision-making, and the relationships being facilitated. In 2023 AD, significant changes were announced. A new entity called the National Prayer Breakfast Foundation was established, distinct from the family's international foundation that had organized the event for decades. The event's new organizers claimed this would provide more transparency, broader religious representation, and clearer separation between the public breakfast and the family's private network. Whether these changes represent genuine reform or simply rebranding remains to be seen, and will likely only become clear with time and continued scrutiny. The family itself continues operating as of 2025 AD, though more cautiously and quietly than in previous eras. Cell groups still meet privately across Washington, D.C., and in cities around the country and world. Relationships still form between powerful people under the banner of Christian fellowship and spiritual mutual support. Influence still flows through personal networks that operate largely outside public view and democratic oversight. They've learned from exposure that operating too visibly invites consequences. They've become more careful about maintaining plausible deniability for their activities. They've gotten better at framing criticism as religious persecution rather than legitimate accountability. But the basic structure remains intact: chosen leaders, divine calling, personal relationships prioritized over institutional transparency, and the belief that changing powerful individuals matters more than changing systems, laws, or democratic processes. The family faces an uncertain future shaped by forces beyond their control. The generation that built and led the organization for decades is aging or gone. Younger leaders inherit an organization whose reputation has been damaged by exposure and whose theology alienates many younger Christians. Democratic institutions are under stress in ways that create both risks and opportunities for movements like the family. Yet the fundamental human realities that the family addressed remain unchanged. Powerful people do face isolation, pressure, and the challenge of integrating their values with their responsibilities. There is genuine value in communities where leaders can be vulnerable, seek guidance, and find support. The question is whether those needs can be met in ways that promote accountability and democratic values, rather than enabling abuse of power. In 1935 AD, Abraham Vereide stood in a Seattle hotel room and believed he heard God telling him to abandon ministry to the poor and recruit the powerful instead. That decision launched a movement that would span 90 years and touch the lives of millions, though most would never know it happened. The family connected American politicians with foreign dictators, facilitating weapons deals and diplomatic relationships that sustained brutal regimes. They shaped policy in ways the public never saw, operating through private breakfast meetings and personal relationships that left no official records or accountability trail. They developed a theology where power validated itself, where chosen leaders operated above normal moral accountability, and where personal failings were always forgiven as long as you remained useful to the cause. The family's story matters not because they were uniquely evil or because the people involved were all cynical manipulators. Most members genuinely believed they were serving God, doing His work in the world, helping leaders find spiritual grounding for their responsibilities. The story matters because it demonstrates how easily good intentions become dangerous when combined with power, secrecy, and theological certainty. How Scripture can be twisted to justify anything if you read selectively enough and ignore everything that contradicts your desired conclusions. How elite networks can shape society while avoiding democratic accountability by wrapping themselves in religious language that makes scrutiny seem like persecution. And how religious conviction, rather than checking power's abuses, can become power's most effective shield against criticism and reform. The lessons from the family's history feel urgent because we live in a moment when democracy seems fragile in ways previous generations in America didn't have to confront. Authoritarian movements are rising globally, often with support from religious nationalists who believe strong leaders chosen by God should govern rather than messy democratic processes that might produce ungodly outcomes. In America specifically, Christian nationalism has become a significant political force with real power to shape elections and policy. Some believers openly question whether democracy is worth preserving if it produces leaders or policies they consider incompatible with Christian values. The family represents an extreme version of this worldview, but they're not alone or isolated in holding it. Their story warns us to be skeptical of power that operates in darkness and refuses transparency, to question religious leaders who celebrate the powerful instead of championing the powerless, to demand accountability in how policy gets made and who influences the people making those decisions, and to remember that unchecked power, no matter how pious its justifications, always trends toward corruption because power itself distorts moral perception and isolates leaders from honest feedback. The National Prayer Breakfast still happens every year in Washington, though under new organizational structures following decades of controversy. Cell groups still meet in homes and offices across the Capitol and beyond. The family, in various forms and under various guises, continues its work. But their story is no longer entirely hidden from view. And in a democracy, visibility matters tremendously, perhaps more than anything else. Because sunlight, as Justice Louis Brandeis wrote over a century ago, remains the best disinfectant for corruption and abuse. Power that cannot withstand scrutiny should not escape it. The questions the family raises extend far beyond one organization or one movement. What do we want our democracy to be and become? How should religion relate to politics in a pluralistic society where citizens hold many different beliefs? Do we believe in genuine accountability for the powerful, or do we accept that different rules apply to those who claim divine mandate for their authority? Should elite networks be able to coordinate policy and wield influence outside public view? Or should democratic governance require transparency about who makes decisions and why? These questions don't have simple answers, and people of good faith can and do disagree about them. But the family's history suggests some principles worth defending regardless of where you fall on broader political or theological questions. Power should be transparent, not hidden behind claims of privacy or religious exemption. Political activity should be disclosed and regulated, even when wrapped in religious language and conducted by religious organizations. Leaders should face accountability through democratic institutions, not just through private counsel from fellow elites who share their interests. And religious faith, at its best, should challenge power rather than serve it, speaking uncomfortable truths even when truth is costly, defending the vulnerable even when it's politically inconvenient, and calling all people, including leaders, to genuine repentance that accepts consequences rather than seeking escape from them. The story of the family is ultimately about human nature's complicated relationship with power. We're drawn to power, fascinated by it, tempted to excuse its excesses when it aligns with our values or advances causes we care about. We want to believe that the right people in charge will solve problems that collective action and democratic institutions struggle with. We're vulnerable to theologies and ideologies that tell us power is noble, that wielding authority is a sacred calling, that those who hold power deserve support rather than scrutiny. But history teaches, again and again with depressing consistency across cultures and centuries, that concentrated, unaccountable power corrupts, not always because leaders are evil or because they start with bad intentions, but because power isolates people from honest feedback, surrounds them with beneficiaries who have incentive to flatter rather than challenge, and creates situations where maintaining power becomes more important than using it justly. The institutions democracy creates, elections, free press, independent courts, civil society organizations, are frustrating and imperfect. They slow things down unnecessarily. They create endless conflict and noise. They prevent decisive action even when such action seems desperately needed. But these institutions exist for crucial reasons learned through painful historical experience. The alternative, trusting leaders to govern wisely without oversight because of their character, faith, or claimed divine calling, has failed catastrophically every single time it's been tried. The family believed they could identify and cultivate leaders whose Christian faith would make them trustworthy with unchecked power and influence. What they actually created was a network that enabled dictators, protected corrupt politicians from accountability, and justified atrocities in God's name while operating entirely outside democratic oversight. They meant well, most of them, sincerely, genuinely believed they were doing God's work, but good intentions without accountability and transparency produce disasters. And theology that cannot question power becomes a weapon power uses against the powerless. As we face our own moment of democratic fragility and rising authoritarianism, the family's story offers warnings we should heed carefully. Be wary of movements that promise to solve complex problems through strong leaders rather than through democratic institutions and processes. Question religious rhetoric that justifies power rather than checking it, that celebrates leaders rather than calling them to humility and service. Demand transparency from those who govern, even when, especially when, they claim to serve God or operate from faith. And remember that Jesus' message was radically about serving the least and sacrificing power, not about accumulating authority and celebrating the greatest. The family got this exactly backward in ways that matter. They built an entire movement around serving power while claiming to serve God, and in doing so, they revealed how easily and completely faith can be corrupted when it forgets that all human power, no matter how piously claimed or religiously justified, must be checked, questioned, and held accountable to something beyond itself. In 1935 AD, Abraham Vereide heard what he believed was God's voice telling him to recruit the powerful. Maybe what he actually heard was the voice of power itself, which always looks for new ways to justify its existence, expand its reach, and shield itself from accountability. Learning to distinguish between those two voices, between God's actual call to justice and power's seductive whisper, is something every generation must do for itself. Our ability to make that distinction clearly may determine whether democracy survives its current crisis and whether faith remains a force for liberation or becomes one more tool of oppression.